Okay, hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is Dora Meredith and I'm the Director of ODI Europe. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us here today, and a big hello to our online audience who are joining us from all around the world. Thank you very much for taking the time. For those of you who are new to ODI Europe, we are a new branch of the Global Affairs think tank, and we're really focused on bringing research, ideas and dialogue with the wider world into the European policy debate. We're really delighted to be hosting this event today as part of our Gender Talk series with our partners UN Women. And this event also supports our Walking the Talk project, where ODI Europe, with 4 other organisations, aims to promote gender equality and feminist principles within European foreign policies. If you'd like to hear more about that project, please do talk to my colleague Aline or do get in touch. So, very excited to be here. I'm going to first hand over to our partner Florence to provide the introduction. Thank you, Florence.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I think it's now been almost a year, I think, that we're holding these gender talks on a monthly basis on different issues with the purposes you set out to really try and raise attention, profile on issues that sometimes are underseen, discussed at policy levels. I think today's it's not necessarily underseen, discussed, but it's often probably not looked at through a transformative gender lens. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your reiterated interest. I think I'm not going to take a long time or talk about the topic much because we have very, very good speakers. I'm biased because Elena was my colleague when I was still in the camp, but she will take you through, I think, a very innovative approach as well on Elena on climate, agriculture, resilience. I think the first thing, of course, and looking at the news this weekend and looking at Spain and Valencia, which is very sad. I don't want to take the time to just discuss that because it's only not just Valencia. It's happened in a lot of places. It happens daily in a lot of places, whether it's floods, droughts or others. But I think maybe because this one is very close to our date and is very close to us geographically, it really reminds us, and it should definitely remind decision makers who are maybe not convinced yet, that climate change is for really this there, it is urgent, and even if we want to mitigate or adapt, we're already very late, and we will need to make some drastic changes in the way we go about business, the way we work, and that's true, of course, in Africa, in other regions for women who are leading on the front of agricultural production and others. This said, I think it's also a very timely moment. I'm sure you've all followed the COP in Cali in Colombia, which I think was also one of the COPs maybe that put at the forefront diversity, the knowledge of indigenous people, of indigenous women, and that takes us to the other dimension, of course, of climate change, climate adaptation. It's not just the fact that women or girls are more affected oftentimes, but they also are oftentimes the ones leading already change, even if it's at a smaller community level, in terms of adapting some strategies, agriculture, others, and production. So it is also a question of how to include them. When I say them, it's in the different economies of the world, in the green, blue economies that are coming up. And you hear a bit from Elena how we're thinking about it in Africa as UN Women. But that definitely goes for Europe and other regions as well. So I think it is both a huge challenge, but it is also an opportunity. And I think we need to remind that. We need to remind that women from diverse origins and different cultures have been resilient, have innovated, and it is also a role, I think, for us in this event, then to be able to bring their voices where they're not necessarily known and seen. So with that, I welcome you all. I already apologize because I'm very frustrated, but I've got a mother emergency with my son calling saying, I'm in front of the house, I have no key. So he's very little. This talks about gender roles. So this means that I will have to leave you in the able hands of our other colleagues from UN Women who are there. ODI, I apologize for this, but I wish you definitely a good seminar, and I will link in so I listen to all of you. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Thomas. Wonderful, thank you. So we are going to kick off firstly, and we're kind of an odd stage setup, so do bear with us, and hopefully online you can see okay. But we have a great panel for you here today. We've got a keynote speaker to kick us off and set the scene. So hopefully online we have Chido Iyaruwata, who is the researcher and director of the Flames and Lilies Climate Initiative and expert within the Walking the Talk Consortium. Is Chido there? And
yes, I am here.
Chido, thank you so much for joining us, and hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Can I pass it to you to give our keynote speech and take us through what you can tell us about the vulnerabilities of women and girls with the impact of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dora. Firstly, I would love to thank ODI Europe and UN Women for inviting me to speak on the critical need for a gender-just transition. As was just mentioned by the previous speaker, we are counting down to COP29 in Baku, and I think it's critical for us to reflect on the gender-climate nexus. So in setting the scene for this panel discussion, I want to highlight 4 elements required for an gender-just transition. These insights emerge from my work on Zimbabwean women's participation in the agriculture sector, and also climate education work with Flames and Lilies Climate Initiative, a youth-led ecofeminist organization. The 6th IPCC assessment report underscores the vulnerability to climate change is exacerbated by inequality and marginalization linked to several socio-economic factors, including gender. And as stated in the background content of this event, women and girls are disproportionately impacted by climate change. However, I think it's critical for us to state that this position is not of their own making. Rather, it is gender inequalities rooted in patriarchal, capitalist, cultural, and religious norms that put women and girls at the periphery. And these interlocking systems of oppression work together to shape intra-household decision-making, access to and control over resources, and also participation in public decision-making. Drawing on my country, Zimbabwe, where 65% of households are headed by males and 35% by females, about 86% of women depend on land for their livelihood and food production, as provided by Care Zimbabwe's research. Within rural areas, 80% of women are living in communal lands, whilst providing at least 70% of labor in the agriculture sector. Such data points have shaped my interest in exploring women's varied participation in the sector through a multimedia research project titled This Land. And some of the insights have highlighted that due to the gender division of labor, women are dependent on natural resources to conduct livelihood and household duties, thus making them more vulnerable to climate shocks, such as the El Nino-induced drought, which has shaped the 2023-2024 agricultural season in Southern Africa. The impacts of this is reduced food stocks, increased food prices, increased water scarcity, and negative household coping mechanisms, including withdrawing boys and girls from school, facilitation of early and forced childhood marriages, and also child labor practices within the waste management and agricultural sector. Whilst this picture highlights the general impacts of climate change on girls and women, I aimed to adopt an intersectional lens to my work. It's important to note that girls and women are not homogeneous entities. Their vulnerabilities are further shaped by age, marital status, their location, ethnicity, and other identities. One category of women that I identified in my study are elderly widow, medium-scale farmers, and one in particular who acquired her property during the Zimbabwean government's land redistribution program. She engages in a variety of economic farming activities, from livestock ranging to horticulture to growing small grains. As we discussed her challenges, she noted that due to energy poverty in her area, there were instances where people would come onto her farm to cut down indigenous trees for firewood. Men who would come with axes are not individuals she would feel safe engaging with. And she also highlighted that other widows who were also farmers, commercial farmers, shared the same grievances as her, especially as the energy crisis worsened. In this instance, climate mitigation measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation through cleaner energy sources are no longer just a matter of electrification, but about creating safer societies where women are free from violence. Her story underlines the need to improve the scope and quality of data to inform gender-responsive policy and program interventions. Gender transformative data is the first element of building a gender-just transition. Without this form of data that is disaggregated by gender, age, or marital status, we are not able to really understand the specific vulnerabilities of the diverse group of women and girls, and also develop pathways to support their adaptive and mitigated capacities. Another key insight from the study is the link between sustainable climate action and women's land rights. Conversations with activists have highlighted that secure land tenure enables women to adopt climate adaptive practices without fear. For instance, we can supplement women's knowledge about water harvesting and encourage them to adopt these practices. However, their efforts may be hindered if decision-making authority lies with male members, and this can range from a husband to a father to even a son. Without access and control over resources such as land and the capital to finance these initiatives, it is difficult to ensure sustainable action. This scenario presents the second element required for a gender-just transition, which is women's effective and meaningful participation in intra-household and public decision-making. Increasing women's participation and leadership in environment and climate leadership at all levels, from local right up until the global level, is critical to shaping and shifting perspectives on leadership and authority, and more importantly, giving women voice on critical matters that impact them. My work with adolescent girls and young women from largely low-income urban areas has shown that access to information about climate change often comes from school, the internet, social media platforms such as X, or even WhatsApp. Yet, even when accessible, information may not be correct, nor does it reveal how climate change intersects with gender, or more importantly, how women and girls can be gender champions. The curriculum and narrative shaping climate education must not reinforce gender stereotypes. It must create a learning environment where both boys and girls can positively contribute to a greener economy and even climate diplomacy roles. With engaging diverse groups of school-going and out-of-school girls, we have seen that there's an urgent need for equitable and inclusive dissemination of climate education. More importantly, contextually relevant materials in languages that are understandable for these different groups to engage. Finally, climate finance proves to be a contentious issue. Funding flows are not predictable, are inadequate for frontline countries and communities. Less than 3% of environmental funding is allocated to women's environmental activism, and only 4% of bilateral allocable ODA with gender equality as the primary objective exists. 2.4% of multilateral funds are set aside for children and youth. This is not enough. And as we go towards COP, we might have another year where climate negotiations continue to reveal disparities between the priorities of governments from Global North and Global South. Holistically, the reality of climate finance goes against the entrenched principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, underpinning developed countries' obligation to provide climate financing to developing countries. Without climate financing, the path to gender-just transition remains elusive. So in conclusion, everyone, a gender-just transition is possible and urgent in our lifetime. Integrating gender equity and climate mitigation and adaptation measures, climate policies, and legislation is not optional, it's essential. Without it, we risk transitioning our economies for the privileged few and creating communities who are unable to withstand and recover from climate shocks. So on this note, I end my address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chido, and we will come back to you in the question and answer session if that's okay for you. Thank you very much for laying out the scene so well. I'd now like to invite to the front our panel, if they would like to come on up, and we will then bring everyone together for the questions at the end. So if you'd like to come on up, and we've got our final panelist, Elena, joining online, if we can. Yes. So I'd firstly like to introduce Annika Flensburg, who is Head of Policy, Advocacy and Press at the saying it wrong, Tilkavina Foundation.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce His Excellency Bitange Ndemo, who is Ambassador of the Republic of Kenya to the Kingdom of Belgium and the European Union. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for joining us. And finally, I'd like to introduce Rishi Kumar, who is Policy Officer within DG Klima of the European Commission, working on multilateral affairs and UNFCCC matters. And I know, Rishi, it's a very busy week with flying to COP actually later this week. And I should just say our final panelist online, Elena Ruiz Abril, who is Senior Policy Advisor at UN Women West and Central Africa Regional Office. Sorry, that's the Senior Policy Advisor, Women's Economic Empowerment. So thank you ever so much for joining us, Elena. Fantastic. So a full room and a great panel. I'd start with you, Annika. Your foundation has recently published a paper looking at gender transformative climate finance based on research with women's rights organisations in Rwanda. And I think that leads us very nicely from what Chido was describing. Could you tell us a little bit about the importance of linking protocols and documents like the Lima Protocol and gender action plans with the financial aspects, as Chido was mentioning and from your research?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having us, Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation. My colleague Bruce is here as well. I can just and for arranging this discussion and panel ahead of COP. So first, I wanted to say that, and as you said, a lot of the things that Chido, looking at the screen now, mentioned is very relevant to our research as well. And I have a few copies here. If you want to grab one afterwards, it's here. And the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation, in English, it's Women to Women Foundation. Was founded 30 years ago, and we support women's and feminist movements in conflict-affected regions. And today we support around 100 organizations, or more than 100 organizations in Western Balkan, Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, MENA, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And the women's activists, the feminist activists that we support, work on peace building, on on conflict resolution, on human security, on economic justice, to end violence against women. But they see more and more how the climate and environment crisis are affecting their lives and their communities and their work, even though that hasn't been their primary focus. And this year's COP, and we see that we need to engage, and partners are also seeing like they need to engage in this area, even though they find it quite challenging because it's a language. It's difficult to grasp and to see how they also should have time to engage in that when they have are 100% busy with their other work, and then this comes on top of that. So how should they manage? But anyway, they see the need, and we also see the need for engaging more. And this year's COP, as many of you know, you can say it's both a gender COP and it's a finance COP, because the Lima program, as you mentioned, will be revised, and the gender action plan. At the same time, hopefully there will be set a new finance goal as well. And from our experience, we see, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Lima program, but that was adopted to ensure a better gender balance, and also a gender mainstream or gender perspective into the parties and the Secretariat's implementation of Paris Agreement. So it's a very important document, and I know, and we have, and a lot of other organizations have been pushing for its implementation and to strengthen the language for this year's COP. But we also know that while we're focusing on that, our experience from the peace and security arena and working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda for 30 years, we know that it's so easy that gender issues are sidelined and pushed to the margins. And you can see that there is a platform. You create a platform where you discuss about gender, but then where the main discussions and decisions are made, it's not there. And we see the risk of that here as well in COP, or we've seen it during the years. And our research shows the importance of linking the two. Like without discussing finance, as Chido, you also said that without discussing finance and resources, there will be no change. So you need to link those two. Chido also mentioned like there's just a few percentages of the ODA climate finance programs that has gender as a primary objective. So there is a real shortage of finance to gender programs and to gender equality. And as you also say that the climate effects are gendered, and the solutions need to be that as well, and to be intersectional, to be effective, of course, and not to strengthen, because I think also the discussions here are not just counting how many women and men, it's actually talking about power structures and transforming a structure that is creating inequalities. And that's what the green transition, it's a hope, it's a wish that this can happen, but it can also just strengthen the inequalities if we're doing it in the wrong way. So that's why the finance sector is so important to look where the money is going. And the research, sorry for coming at the Rwanda study that we did, and we support women's organization in Rwanda and have done so for very long. And they also witnessed what Chido also said, the impacts it has on their work and on women and girls in Rwanda. Looking at the 85% of the small farmers in Rwanda are women. So of course, when there are unpredicted weather events and patterns and floodings and droughts, that affects women and their livelihoods. And women also have unpaid work, and they are responsible for collecting water, food, etc. And cooking for their children. So that, of course, also is affected. And we also see the increase of child marriages and stress in communities with increased level of domestic violence due to economic stress. We also see heightened risks of conflict levels in communities, in local communities where they work. So there are many different ways that we see the effect. And when we had also, so we had that like this mapping to what the effects, gendered effects of the climate crisis is. And we also see, okay, but what So we did this together with our partners in Rwanda and also with an organization called Development Initiative, who are more a data expert organization. So we came together to use our different knowledges, and what Chido also said, that we need more data to actually see where the money is, what is the situation on the ground, where is the money going. So that's why we also said we need to see where the financial flows are, because we know what the needs are, where is the money then? We talked with women's organizations, you know about climate finance? And a lot of them said that what the hurdles were, and they said, we don't know about it, or we don't know what door to knock on. And we said, you're not going to knock on the door, they should knock on your door to help, to ask for your help and your expertise. But they said it's so difficult to access and it's so technical, the language is so difficult. Are we eligible? We're a women's rights organization, we're not an environmental organization, so are we applicable? And also then it comes to the more general problem is with that women are excluded from decision making for us as well. So that's also like cutting across all of these, that they are excluded. So there are a lot of different hinders that we saw in Rwanda that I don't think is unique for Rwanda, but also highlights the problem when there is a gap between the human rights or the women's rights organization of feminist movement and the environment and movements and knowledge. So there we saw that there is a need to bridge this gap as well, knowledge gap, like to empower the different groups. And what we saw when it came to the finance, then we knew that what the hinders, like what were the hinders, but also when it came to the tracking of finance, we found that it was extremely hard to see where the money was going, because of that both when it came to countries and IFIs like the World Bank and the big funds like Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund use markers inconsistently or don't use them at all or have different markers. So that was really difficult to get a picture of what is it actually, where the money is going. And as we said also that just a small proportion of all the funding had gender as the primary objective, also in Rwanda, a little bit more than an average, but it was still just almost 4%, but that's still quite a small chunk of money going to this. So, and we also saw that we're looking at, okay, that was the proportion, and what did those 3.6% go to mainly? And that was farming and energy, but not so much to health, not so much to disaster risk distraction. So there was like all of these other fields that women had identified as important didn't get any funding. So that was also something that we saw. So maybe I can stop there and I can come back to solutions more, because we also, of course, see that there are potentials and there are great potential that if they are addressed and met, we can do a lot of good change. But we need this also, the brief just showed that we need more data. As previous speaker said, we need more to know and also be more transparent in where the money is actually going and who decides where the money should go.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we're going to come back to some of these points, but you mapped it out incredibly well. So thank you. Your Excellency, I'd like to come to you now to hear a little bit about the important work that's been going on in Kenya. We at ODI Europe, and UN Women really commend the work that's been happening throughout your national plan. I wondered if you could share some of the successes that you've seen, but also kind of any of the challenges that you've seen in implementing gender into your climate plans.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. My voice is not very good. I think I'll use a mic. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's not like Kenya has done so well in this. We're also struggling with so many concepts within the space. I was chairing the Sustainability Committee in the OECPS, and I sometimes had to stop people from speaking because they would say UNFCCC, Lima, whatnot, and I said, can an ordinary person understand this? It is true, people don't get to these concepts. There are too many. Kenya, sometime 2010, we had a new constitution. And this is part of the solutions that policy rules and regulations must be out there, and you must do awareness so that women themselves can begin to talk about it. Kenya is an African country with very strong cultural foundations, some Christianity, some religious beliefs. So we're still struggling to be able to overcome this strong cultural and religious, which impact on women, because generally, even in the constitution, as we agreed that women should be equally given land as men, still culture doesn't allow that women can have equal land. My two kids, that I should give my daughter and my son, and my brothers would say, what would your daughter come to do in our place? And that's our daughter. So we still have a lot of problems, but it has worked to some extent, in the sense that education is one of the reasons why that most women have acquired education. Most women are able to interpret national legislations, the constitution, they see women talking about it. And because of that, and keeping numbers, for example, we say that our National Assembly must have 30% of women representation. Straight elections, you cannot get 30%. So they must find ways of nominations and other things. That has worked very well. That political parties now are able to say, we have nominated this much from our party. So it's not very easy to simply say that the country has succeeded. There's so many areas. Data is very critical in terms of talking what has happened, how many kids are going to school, how many women are going to school. Some of the good data that you get in Kenya is that you have now more women in college than men. Because I've been teaching for many years, and I have seen the numbers begin to switch, which is good. But we must emphasize that something else must make us to change culturally, and something else must speak to religious groups that we are all equal. So I can't say that we have succeeded exceedingly, but we have succeeded to some level relative to other countries where this culture and religion are very strong, and we have still not shaken up. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points that you've made as well in the wider discussions. I've certainly got follow-ups that I'd like to ask, but I'm aware I'll go through the panel first, and I'll come to you next. Eleanor, could you tell us a little bit more about your work with UN Women and your experiences that you've seen in West and Central Africa from where you're sitting, please?
Thank you so much, and congratulations on organizing this discussion precisely this week. So as you said, I'm based in Dakar, and I work at UN Women's regional office that covers West and Central Africa. So this region includes areas such as the Sahel, which are one of the most vulnerable to climate change in the world. So a lot of the work that UN Women does has to do with climate change, vulnerability, seeing the impact of climate change on the countries in the region and how that manifests in different ways for men and women, for boys and girls. It has a lot to do with adaptation. It's a conversation about how we adapt to the new reality. It's a conversation about the unequal impact of climate change, whether it's through natural disasters. I mean, we just heard Florence referring to what's happening in Spain this week. Just to give you an idea, the last couple of months, just with random conversations with my colleagues, we've had floods in Senegal, Nigeria, Niger, Sierra Leone, and this happens every year. So climate change is really present in this region. So for a long time, UN Women has focused on unpacking those differentiated impacts. I mean, I think most of this has been very nicely put by Tito with examples of how it manifests for women. But when it comes to gender and climate change, there are many different dimensions of this nexus. There's the care nexus, I mean, increasing the time that women spend collecting wood, water, caring for the sick as a result of climate change or natural disasters. There's also the security, gender-based violence nexus that Annika referred to. So the role of UN Women is to document those and to work with civil society and with governments to try to find solutions, including integrating these elements into national policies. But more recently, and I think this was after COVID, with this idea of building forward better, we also started to look at what about the transition to the low carbon emission economy in the region. I mean, this is going to be big. This is probably the most important transformation that we will see in our lifetime. So what's going to happen to women and girls? I mean, in the past, we know every time there was a big socioeconomic transformation, women and girls were on the side of the losers. So what's going to happen this time? Where are the green jobs? Where are the opportunities going to be created? And where are women and girls in relation to those? So there has been a lot of focus on mapping green jobs, mapping green entrepreneurship opportunities for women, and seeing what needs to happen so that women and girls can access those in the coming years. An important element of that conversation is green finance. I mean, climate finance. Annika mentioned it. We could have a whole webinar just talking about that. It's a critical issue, and we are working with the grassroots women to build capacity to design financial mechanisms that are adapted to these women who are at the forefront of the climate fight, but cannot access carbon markets. So there's a lot of that access to green jobs, green finance, green entrepreneurship, a lot of work on social norms, because when you come to the policy elements of this, and I know I'm talking to a room full of policymakers, so that there's a lot of tunnel vision sometimes. When you talk about green jobs, everybody focuses on skills, if you are lucky, entrepreneurship, but nobody talks about social norms. And without addressing the inequalities in unpaid care work, the stereotypes, it doesn't matter. I mean, you will have skills, but still women and girls won't be accessing those opportunities in the coming years. So just to give you an example, in Senegal, we are working with the government integrating gender in the green taxonomy, which is basically in relation to what counts and what doesn't as green finance, and how can we make sure that we leverage the gender co-benefits of those green investments. We are working with them as well in improving the gender dimension of their national green jobs strategy. And we are also obviously working with them on the national determined contribution revision. I mean, we have a fantastic window of opportunity from now to February to get those CDNs at the right level of ambition, but also with the right components in terms of gender, so that the interest and the needs of women are there. So those are some of the examples of things that we are doing. And maybe I can stop there, and I have others that I can lay out during the discussion if the participants are interested.
Great, thank you so much. That's great. Rishi, coming to you. So finally, the work of the EU and DG Klima. As I said, it's a very busy week or month for you. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the successes and challenges that you've experienced, for example, in the implementation of the Green Deal or in other wider policy areas in trying to bring in the perspectives and voices of women and girls.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to the panel. I think as Annika mentioned, we are right at the forefront of the upcoming COP, which is not only on finance that gets a lot of the attention, but we're also discussing about the work on the next gender action plan. And some of the discussion that we see today is directly reflected to a bit more of the technical lingo that we speak about in the UNFCCC. And I think this, as part of the series of talk, is really what is needed to make it a bit more understandable and accessible about some of the core issues that we face in those sessions. So what I want to share is a little bit about what the EU has put in place together with its member states, but also the challenges that we have faced. And I think a lot of it you've heard in the different country examples, but this here is a bit more the European experience through it. And I imagine in terms of successes, just 4 or 5 years ago, when the Green Deal was introduced, it was its first of its kind European legislation to put climate action at the heart of most of our policies that we would undertake. And already within that, we introduced the climate law. And in the climate law, we have a recital that talks about the importance to look into the impacts on different vulnerable situations, on gender equality, on human rights. So we tasked ourselves from the beginning that if we take climate action and if we take more action, how do we take that into account? And when we started to put the law into practice by putting in place Fit for 55, there was this opportunity that we lay out in the communication that we say that, okay, we can look at the green transition, but we need to look at it in a way that takes into account the opportunities that this can give and some of the challenges. So translating that from a vision into practice has been a challenge, and that has been ongoing through our separate policy fields. I think one of the key policies that I can highlight is the work on the Social Climate Fund. So from next year on, together with member states, we'll put in place some legislation that will take into account how are our climate policies impacting the different situations of people that might need additional assistance to either cope with the rising costs, cope with vulnerabilities. And this is something that is the first time that we're really actively looking into. The same, one of the challenges that we saw is with the work with the national energy and climate plans. Like this is one of the tools that we have to encourage member states to report. How in the next 10 years will you achieve your climate objectives? There is an element of reporting on gender considerations, but we know and we have seen also in our recommendations that the reporting on gender is one of the big challenges. And I think this links as well to some of the key discussions here. Similarly, we've heard elements related to adaptation. In 2021, when we introduced our adaptation strategy, already there was a recognition that this has a gender component. The risks we know are aware of is there present. And just last year, we had the European Climate Risk Assessment, UCRA, if you might have heard of it. And that provided an adaptation assessment, like what are the key pillars that we really need to look into when we think about adaptation. And in there, gendered impacts, vulnerable communities, all of it was mentioned as something that in the EU we need to spend more time and attention on. So that is a bit how in the EU it has developed. We have put in place a policy framework, but it needs more work. And I think linking it to the international discussion, what you've heard from the UNFCCC, the Gender Action Plan. Also, when we started with that plan, it really put in place this talk between all the parties to build on gender mainstreaming, getting involved with decision makers, building coherence. And I think a key success there is the work of the national climate change and gender focal points, because these are focal points that are in every, well, supposedly in every party that put in place a person that should try and link gender and climate change. The issues that these people face, also within the EU, are different, because how can you as a focal point work in one ministry, maybe on climate action, but try and link up what's happening with the ministry on economics? So these issues are really some of the core things that we see in there. And then of course, we had the European Gender the IGA report on gender equality in the Green Deal that came out, I think, in 2023, if I'm correct. And that gave some of the more data underpinning of like, how are we doing in terms of implementing Fit for 55? And we saw that there's more work needed to be done on energy poverty. There's more work needed to be done related to transport, because even this had a gender component to it. At the same time, even in the European situation with the member states, there's a decision-making aspect that needs further implementation of the different elements there. And I think this is really needed, that we see as some of the progress that we're booking, but because we're booking some of the progress, we also see the rising challenges. I'll leave it here. I have much more to say, but I don't want to go too much over time, so I'm giving it back to you.
Thank you so much. Annika, can I come to you more then in thinking about what should be done now, and thinking particularly about the COP, about the new goal, the new action plans. What more can governments do? And talking also about that link to implementation.
Because I think that's the big thing, as you also said, that there are policies in place, but now it's like up to what next? How do we implement them? And I'm talking to different people about the negotiations about the revised Lima program now, the Gender Action Plan, and there are now it's more like protecting what's already in there, because there is a backlash on gender equality globally that we see in different parts, and that's also in the climate field. So that's what we also are facing now, which I think is important for us to be aware of, that there is a pushback on gender also here. And there are a lot of countries who don't want to see stronger language on gender and don't want to see the link with finance. So that's what we're facing also. But having said that, it's very important that EU is also an important voice, of course, that there is a clear link with the new finance goal to the Lima program, to see that this connection is made. So that's one thing. And we also see that what you mentioned with the gender and climate focal points. That's also one thing that is now, at least, I don't know, next week, but in the Lima program, which is important. But for that, they need these people, and we know from previous experience as well, they need resources, they need mandates, they need to have status, and they have to actually have an impact, because otherwise it's just a tick a box and nothing happens. But if they get all of these resources, mandates, etc., they are important. So that's one important thing, but that's also a discussion on funding. How should Global North support Global South in these positions? So that's also a discussion on finance. And another thing that we need also to discuss, I think, is the architecture or the mechanism for climate finance. If we look at the research showed that the traditional adaptation funds, the decisions are strengthening, are authorizing the elites, like they are very top down. So they are just strengthening the already power structure in place. And that's the adaptation fund, for example, and the Green Climate Fund as well. And it's government to government or government to implementing parties. And the risk is that it doesn't trickle down to local communities. And there are some interesting new designs in place, like the Green Climate Fund, for example, have a new program where the government should decentralize or disperse certain percentage to local communities. And so that will be interesting to look at and see if that's a possibility where we actually could decentralize and make it more accessible, the funding to local communities. But then, of course, that needs also to have a gender dimension. So it's not just the local leaders who often are male. So we always have to have the gender dimension into this as well. And maybe also require that a certain percentage is actually targeting, is actually gendered of this funding. So that's, and then of course another thing to enable this is also to make the climate action and responses effective is to include women's organizations. It's something that we often say, but repeat, but it's worth repeating. And then they need funding to be able to equally participate throughout the UNFCCC process and in national policies development and local policy developments. So they need sustained funding to do this and to be properly also, because of course, if you don't advise or consult with the local communities, how can the like the adaptation or the measures to adapt societies to protect you from floods, etc., be effective if you don't talk with the people living there? And our experience is also that women's organizations often are have their ear on the ground and know what's happening. So they are also very smart to consult with them because they have the early warnings, early warning, what do you say? They know what's happening. So that's also one. And then, of course, increased transparency, because that's also linked to the research that we did, that we need more consistent gender markers and climate markers. Sorry if you didn't hear me down there. No, but we need also increased transparency, as we talked about before, to put requirements on the parties, on national governments, and also on other organizations, actually UN and World Bank and the Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund, to use consistently markers so we can track where the money is going. And it would be easier if they use the same markers as well, so you can actually compare between the different funds and funding streams. So that is one thing. And also what Chido said before, that when you do assessments of projects in local communities, they should be on local languages and be short and concise, not in English and 80 pages, which no one really can read. So that is also an aspect of making it more transparent and accountable to what is happening. Yes, so I think I can stop there for the moment, and we can come back to other things.
Please, thank you.
I just want to congratulate you for bringing the word transparency. Africa's emission is about 3%, isn't it? And other places is way up there. The Amazon and the Congo Basin are like the carbon sinks in this world. But if you go to Congo, women there are the poorest. And I saw something in Kenya, someone organized that women now, according to Lima something, you come together, we would give you carbon credits. And they were giving, I think it's $8 per ton. What is it? That is, you know that? Do you know the World Bank has a price? I think it's around 80.
Okay.
And do you know what they paid the women at the village? It is 50 cents. So there is a lot of theft in between. I'm sorry, I'm not a diplomatic now. Yes, yeah. There's a lot of shenanigans in between. There are people who know how to make money. Try and say, I have a forest here. You would have to see some consultant who is, and it's a pretty straightforward thing. Too many people in between before you get to the real person on the ground. So I suggest one more thing is that we have a blockchain solution to see who was paid what. So we can now begin to question. The Middle Eastern countries are now selling their emissions from oil to African poor people at cents. It's very nothing. You find Elon Musk pays General Motors in the US, and the emission levels are still very high. So when we talk about climate finance, I don't know what you mean if it can be defined. Otherwise, some of us are just following, and some consultants in between minting resources and leaving the other very poor down there. Yeah.
Sorry. No, it's good. I appreciate your thoughts, so thank you. I'm now going to open up to the audience, actually, instead of doing another round, just because I'm aware of the time and I know that we have to finish quite promptly at past. But first, there was a question online, actually, from one of my lovely colleagues, Maori, who's asked, some people are now mooting the idea of scoping feasibility for a dedicated Women and Climate Fund under the UNFCCC. What do the speakers think about this idea? Is it worth exploring? Does anyone want to come in on that question?
I can come in if you want.
I don't know. Yes, that would be great.
Thank you. I think it's definitely worth exploring. The climate finance architecture as it is, I completely agree with what the ambassador and Annika said. It kind of reproduces a lot of the inequalities that are out there, especially gender inequalities. So having a dedicated mechanism, it could, to some extent, probably not solve the whole problem, but kind of mitigate some of the issues. I mean, we are in a situation where women do a lot of the carbon sequestration and preservation of the ecosystems in the region. I'm talking of my region. But then it's impossible to access climate finance, the mechanisms that are there precisely to compensate for that type of work that most of the time is also unpaid. So the fact that most of the climate finance is channeled through the banks, through traditional mechanisms. I mean, if already to access bank finance, women have a really hard time. I think the gender credit gap in Africa is in the billions. So when you add the layer of complexity of climate finance with the accreditations, it's really complicated. So I think for a long time, UN Women has been considering this idea of creating a climate action fund for a women rights organization. And part of that should be for women's rights organizations that can also build the capacity of grassroots women to apply to many of these complex processes. So definitely it's an idea worth exploring. I think it's very important that in COP we talk about the qualitatives of finance. Is not only about establishing a common goal, it's about how are we going to channel that finance. And it's also about the loss and damage fund. As we define it, let's be mindful that we need to take into account not only the economic losses, but also these other impacts on women, on the communities, and really assess with a broad perspective the impact and the concept of loss and damage. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Would anyone else like to give their view? Oh.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, super. Yeah, I think this is one of the core questions that we face at the current COP, because on one side we're discussing the NCQG. I hope that's not too technical, the new collective quantified goal. And that's not only a discussion about what this goal should be in terms of the total amount of finance given, but it's also a discussion on how do we see the future of the type of finance that is there. So I think the discussion on a dedicated fund for gender is very much linked to how we have these talks at the COP in the current session. Like, how will we ensure that this collective goal takes into account maybe elements of loss and damage, finance mobilization, but also gender equality aspects. When it comes to providing finance to these funds, the EU's position generally is that we need to mainstream gender considerations, not only in the process. So how does the funds give financing to the different activities? Who is involved in the decision-making? And this is something that we talked about just a few minutes ago, that the decision makers quite often are not the ones really on the ground. So it should be a discussion in terms of process, like how does the funds work? How do we get access to financing in there? But also it should be in terms of the outcome. Like, how does the funds provide finance for the different gender considerations? So for me, I think we see these different funds that exist, and we need to think about, there is something now that we notice that, okay, money is maybe not flowing as directly to where we want it to be. So is it a process? Is it an outcome? And how does that tie into the end goal that we want to achieve at this COP? Of course, the EU, like the finance that we do via the multilateral domain, via the existing funds is one part. The EU in itself also provides different types of financing. But I think that's a bit outside of the scope. I think if you look at the multilateral process, for me, it's a part of the mainstreaming into it, both process and outcome based.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I can just say very, very quickly, I think it's also, in a way, I can see the benefit of having a special fund, but at the same time, you don't want it to be marginalized, and that's where all the money for gender is, where the risk is. It's like a gender focal point. It's good because it enhances and it can drive things, but if it's just that, then what are the rest of the money going to? Is that gender blind? So I think there are benefits, but you need to be really careful with how you design it and not to exclude gender from the rest of the talks, as you said, that you need to include it in the new finance goal and the architecture of that as well.
Just to add on this is, if you want to buy NVIDIA stock, you go to the stock market. If you want to buy carbon credits, where do you go to the bank? Where do you go to the bank, which is not a market? Yeah, that is where the problem is.
Sure, that's it. I just thought I should bring in Chido, if you can rejoin us for this question and answer section. That would be great. And so I'd like to open up to the floor. I've got a question that's also been added from online, but please do keep sending them in. Are there any questions here in the room? At all?
Where are the men?
Okay. Oh, I see a couple of questions. Perhaps we'll take the two.
Thank you. I don't want to sound controversial, but sometimes we feel that, or I feel that COP is a lot of talking, but maybe a bit of a lack of concrete impact. So my question to the panelists, I guess, is what would good look like to you in terms of one concrete progress or action that we can hope for that COP?
Thank you. Should we just take a couple of questions and then come to the panel? So thank you.
I wanted to ask about the participation aspect that you mentioned before, because I think it's really, really important that civil society, NGOs, women on the ground have a say and are involved. But from my experience, it often ends up being a show process where everyone is invited to a stakeholder roundtable, and in the end, those recommendations are not really taken into account. So I was wondering if there are any best practice examples where this participation process really works and those who have the knowledge are really heard, and then also, and the policies are implemented in a way that really works.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So two great questions there. What does good look like, and best practices in terms of engaging and true dialogue, I suppose. Anybody want to kick us off? Elena, Chido?
Happy to go with the second one, for example, on participation. I think it's a very, very good point. Not sure I can share good practices, but some insights. Civil society, but also we've been referring a lot to the national gender and climate change focal points. One thing is that they might not be at the table. Just to give you an example, UN Women is financing trips to COP for these national focal points because they weren't part of the initial delegations for some countries. But beyond being there, you need to have the capacity to engage in the negotiations, right? So many of the times, what you find is that the discussion becomes really technical, and that civil society might be ready to have the discussions, and they work on the space, on the nexus between gender and climate. For the national focal points, sometimes if you are lucky, they are from the Ministry of Environment and they know about climate change, but that doesn't mean that they know about gender at all. So there is a lot of need to build that capacity so that the participation is meaningful and can have an impact. A couple of weeks ago, we organized a meeting with all the members of the ECOWAS member states, bringing together the civil society and also gender and climate change focal points precisely to talk about COP, to talk about the gender agenda, and to see what are some of the elements of the advocacy that need to happen. So that's just an example, but it goes beyond this COP. This has to be a process that goes over and over, and really something that the global north could invest in building that capacity of critical players in this negotiation and discussion.
Thank you. Chido, did you want to come in on either of the questions?
Yes, I did. Sorry. I wanted to answer around the first question around what was, for feminists, what would it be like to have a feminist COP? And I think something that Elena just touched on, which really spoke to me, is that it's feminist climate action is not just COP. COP is one moment of continuous action. And I think that is something that we need to start having within our spaces, to recognize that, yes, this is a pivotal moment where international negotiations are occurring, and we need to shape that agenda with the work that we're doing and bringing the realities and impacts of climate change with the communities that we're working on. But I think it's important not to center this event in the work that we're doing. We have to build the capacities of our states, but also within civil society as well, because sometimes there are disconnects, as within our feminist groups. We might not understand how economic justice intersects with climate justice as well. And sometimes I know in spaces that I've interacted, they might feel like, oh no, but climate change is not something that's relevant for the work that I'm doing. But as coming out from the discussions with the panelists, we're seeing that climate change impacts every facet of our lives and in our societies. So I think it's important for us to go to these events and to contribute to the agenda and make sure that women and girls' voices and realities are shaping the dialogue. But I think it's also important to know that this is one moment of continuous work that we do in our activism and our research and the different manifestations of feminist climate justice.
Great, thank you, Chief. We've got another couple of questions that have come in from the online audience. So one question from Ursula, which says, so much of what has been discussed is relevant to other underrepresented groups, notably people with disabilities impacted heavily by climate change. Can the panel give a flavour of their approaches to work in an intersectional way, looking at multipliers of working with gender alongside rights organisations, focused on other characteristics, for example? So that's a great question there. And another one from Gaia, who says, women's organisations face challenges in accessing climate finance due to the complex application process and technical language. We've talked a lot about that. What steps could be taken to simplify these processes and build the capacity of organisations to engage effectively with climate finance mechanisms? Would anybody like to come in on either of those questions? Yes.
I think when you put the burden of learning on somebody who is in that side, you almost not get anything out of it. I think what we should advocate is fairness, that we are getting into this business and we are doing it because we are all affected, that those who are coming to buy the carbon credits should also equally feel responsible that this capacity building, you will never finish the number of people. That, as I said earlier, there are too many concepts: climate adaptation, climate finance, climate. Even before you understand this, COP29 is going to come with other new definition, which you will not understand. I don't know whether it is by design or it is accidental that new concepts come up, which they can't be explained. And also, we need to define some of these concepts very clearly, what it means, so that when you go to court, you know what the limits of the other side. Now, there isn't. Just someone throw a concept and it can be interpreted by as many people as possible. So if we think about fairness, that we live in the same earth, we should not be exploiting women because they didn't have the knowledge and say, oh, we will build capacity so that next time. I have had this name capacity for a very long time, and it has never been corrected.
Thank you. So really about trying to, take action to simplify things and make them more accessible.
I said blockchain, which I forgot.
Yeah. Brilliant.
I think that's a really key point, because the climate arena is really exclusive and difficult to access. So I think that's a responsibility for governments and policymakers to make it more democratic and more inclusive, because otherwise it's just for the elite again, strengthening the power and decision making among those already in power. So I think that's really, really important, and that's what we see among women's rights organizations as well. They know what climate change is, they know what the environmental crisis is, but they don't know the wording. So that's what's hindering them from actually taking action, because they see it's in something more difficult than it is. It's part of their realities. So I think that's a really something that should take on by the politicians and policymakers, and from civil society as well. I mean, we have a role to play there as well, to try to translate and make it more accessible. And when it comes to also the intersectionality, that was the question, how we engage with different groups that are being disproportionately affected. Like the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And we support queer organization, women who work with disability and with different kind of, different groups with different, that have different needs and are vulnerable or discriminated against because of different issues. So we are, and I think that's important to also build that movement and to cooperate between and not be, to be inclusive in the movement building. And I was thinking like one success stories, if you want, from policy making, I was thinking it's not recent, but just looking at the oncoming from Sweden. And we wouldn't be where we are with the laws that we have if it wasn't for a strong women's movement. It's all thanks to the women's movement that we have the laws in place that we have in Sweden. Without them, they wouldn't be there. And it's the same with the progress so far when it comes to queer rights in Sweden as well. That's thanks to the civil society organizations and to the movement, and for movements to come together and work together and not giving up. And I think that's the long term. It is possible to make a change, but you need to be not to give up and to be persistent and find allies, both among other organizations and among policymakers and decision makers. So I think it's possible, but you need to do the strategy and to have people who support you so you don't get tired and give up or get burnt out. So I think that's important, and the inclusivity, I can never thank you, is really, really important as well. And if I would say that one success from this COP, I think if we can get the word gender transformative into, I mean, that's like a small little word, but if we really see that this is about transformation of societies, to actually come to the root causes of gender inequalities, that would be something big and something that we can refer to, even though it's just a word, but words can make a difference. So that would be a great success, I think.
Exactly. Thank you. Rishi, would you like to come in?
Is there another question?
No, I think we've had quite a few, so I think we can focus on those, particularly thinking about your expectations for the COP and what success would look like.
Yes, no, exactly. I think in discussion, we see a few core elements come back. It's about increasing participation. How can you make participation meaningful? And what would be the successful outcome that is based on inclusivity, taking on board the views from people actually active on the ground? And I think maybe to start with the participation movement that the colleagues on the panel already discussed, it differs really party by party in terms of how much resources do they have, time constraints, and also the visibility that they can give to the topic. And I think in the case of the EU, we've been a bit more fortunate that we have 27 member states that can be accessed and try to advocate to that please raise gender components in the negotiations. I know that we recently had our submission on the final review of the Gender Action Plan, where we went to each member state and we spoke and we said, like, what are some of your ideas that we can put forward in this next action plan? And that was a bottom-up approach. Every member state came with their ideas and we put it together in a submission on the UNFCCC portal. But that comes because in the EU, we have this whole system of how we do our submissions and public consultation, but that's a position of where we're very fortunate to do that. And of other parties, it's a bit more like they have to balance a lot of different elements. And for gender, they would need someone that has the technical capacity to say, like, on this topic, I need to be strong on the following elements. And that has to do with resources, that has to do with insights. And there, I think it's useful to be very concrete. And I think as best practice, just at the last bond session, I had a chat with the European Disability Forum visitors that came to the bond session. And they raised some important elements to the things that they were listening to as observers in the room and said that there's this discussion happening on the Gender Action Plan, but have you thought about like these disability components that we might need to take a look into? And that triggers conversations with the member states, with your stakeholders to have that going. So I think as a best practice, I would put that forward. In terms of what would be a success, well, there are immediate steps for how the Gender Action Plan can move forward. I think a big topic that I would like to be seen addressed further is elements related to the just transition in terms of how in the next Gender Action Plan are we looking at it? Like what do the different parties need to help address some of the questions surrounding that? But I would also like to see, and that's maybe like the most optimist endpoint for the coming discussions, is to see the gender elements across the different negotiation rooms. So when we go to the mitigation work program, we see a discussion on gender or some gender language. The same for the just transition. Like if we can get gender not only to be taught in the context of the gap, but in the different rooms, I think you'll have much more progress and less siloing also of the national climate change and gender focal points.
Thank you, that's an excellent point. I think as we're now just wrapping up, I'd just like to ask if any of the panelists would still like to say, you know, if there's anything we've not covered that you think is an important message, or, you know, coming up in the next year, you know, how do we keep the momentum going on this important agenda? Would anyone particularly like to come in on anything they've not covered yet?
I see a lot more needs. We need to do more, especially in Africa, in the sense that I kept on making reference to conceptualization of some of the concepts that come up in these discussions. Sometimes even the people in my place, we need to synthesize that concept for them to understand and how it relates to the activities they're doing on the ground. And it's a prayer to my sister here, that this is what we need to do on the ground. If they understand, they can demand it. If they don't understand, they will not seek for it. So this is awareness creation at the bottom of the pyramid. We usually call for conferences where many of those women cannot attend. And you get representatives who would not actually take the message to them. This is where unfairness begins, that they don't hear it firsthand from places like where we are seated here or in other places. And of course, I keep on saying we need to expand coverage, especially internet, because now they are seeing many of these things. We must simplify the messages, put them in the social media, and build the future generation. Learning only doesn't come in seminars. Getting it in bits, it would help that people can ask the right questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elena, any final thoughts from you?
Thank you. So maybe some final thoughts on what success look like. I really love what I've heard from the different panelists. I mean, this idea of having gender in the different negotiation tracks, that would really be success, but real success. But I think I'm not as optimistic. So perhaps I'm gonna settle with a good gender action plan that consolidates what we've achieved so far. As Annika mentioned, we are at tough times and with a lot of backlash. Every single word that it's being contested. So let's consolidate what we have. And I also like what Chido says. This is just one item in a long road, and we need to continue. It's a process, and continue investing in women at the different levels so that they really can participate not only in this COP but the next COP and the things that are in between at the different levels. I'm thinking of my region. And I think the issue of women's participation and capacity building is also highly in the agenda at the different levels.
Great, thank you very much. Chido, did you have any final thoughts?
Yes, I did. Sorry, it seems my camera keeps coming in and out, but I think for me, it is critical that we ensure that women have effective and meaningful participation in the processes. I think for being perhaps someone who's at a grassroots level, one of the issues that have come about that we've observed is that even when we go to national consultation meetings or even workshops, we might see that women might not feel comfortable to articulate their concerns, even though they have the knowledge about climate change and the impacts and the change that they want. But I think it's critical that we create platforms for them to enhance their knowledge, but also gain the confidence to articulate their perspectives in these critical spaces. So I think if that is something that we aim to push and ensure that that can translate to increased participation at the COPs, but I think also at the local level, it's important. Even when we think at a ward level, at a rural level, women's participation at the national resource committees, how are resources being managed in our communities as well. So I think it's also about the importance of investing in local action that will sweep up to the global level as well. So I think those would be my closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, that's great. Can I come to you next, Rishi? Any closing thoughts?
Well, do I need the mic or no? I think we've discussed quite a few different elements of what success would be. I think indeed the coming COP is one part of the multilateral calendar on how to discuss gender and the different gender elements. For me, what I see happening is that next year the focus will shift and we'll talk about the NDCs and the adaptation strategies. And I think for me, what we really need to have in there is to have the right participants that can contribute to those discussions. So whether that is via the UNFCCC process as a stakeholder or constituency, or via the member states, the parties that are now in the process of preparing their NDCs, their long-term adaptation strategies. I think for me, success would be if we can get the conversation on gender within those and try to have that broader stakeholder consultation. So I think in addition to some of the challenges that we saw today, I think it would be good if the perspective can be more inclusive and trying to have that in those discussions.
That's great. And finally, Annika, any final thoughts from you?
I'm just echoing what the previous speakers. I think that women's participation is key here for the discussion that we have today, the equal participation, and that we know that we talked about here, that the backlash, both for women's human rights defenders, but also civil society in general, that it's shrinking, and that we know that the threats and harassments against women human rights defenders, as well as environmental activists, is increasing because they challenge power structures and big financial interests. So they need to be at the table and have safe spaces. So I think that's really key to ensure and finance safe spaces for them to influence decisions and for the decisions to be effective and good decisions. So I think that's, yeah, that would be successful as well if that can be ensured. And just one thing, when I was thinking now, also when we talk about the new finance goal, that but governments have struggled to achieve, we can also think of other financial flows that, like the fossil fuel subsidies, that are far greater and bigger. I think it's the G20 countries have like 1.4 trillion, I think, in fossil fuel subsidies. So I think we also need to have that in perspective, that if there is a political will, we can increase the funding for climate finance. So just also to bear in mind that we need to look at the bigger picture, also where the money is going. And how it's channeled. So I think, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, both online and in person. Thank you so much. Give them a round of applause. And a huge thank you to all of you for all of the questions. I think we've covered a huge amount today. We've swept through the different challenges that we're facing on this incredibly important topic. I mean, it's hard for me to kind of give a summary because we've covered so much, but we went into climate finance, into challenges on education, on cultural religious beliefs, on access to decision makers, access to information, the issue of translating law into implementation, and the need to avoid reproducing inequalities. Then we had a big discussion in terms of what we need to do and the importance of linking to the international discussions. We need to build the evidence base, to use some of the mechanisms that are already in place, like the gender and climate focal points, the connections between Lima and climate finance. But there were also some really interesting points about power, the fact that we need to be having very purposeful design around some of the climate funds, but also the decision-making structures that are around them, the importance of transparency, the importance of consistent markers of gender in some of these instruments. And yes, I think overall the importance of participation came through very, very strongly. So I think from our side, there's a lot of learning there on the clear things that need to be done. And of course, the big thing now will be doing it. So thank you once again to everyone for coming. I'd like to particularly thank colleagues Aline, Youssef, David, Claire and Maggie, who have from ODI Europe's side done such a huge amount of work on pulling this event together, along with Sophie, Saskia and Florence at UN Women and their colleagues who have also done a huge amount of work. Please do keep in touch. We'll have our next gender talk on the 5th of December, which will be on the future of European foreign policy and taking a feminist approach to that. We'd love to see you there. And in the meantime, please do stay in touch as we work on all of these important issues where I think partnership is absolutely key. So thank you again. There are drinks and a lot of food, snacks outside, so please do stay if you can. Thank you.